So, hi everyone, and welcome to the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University. This is one of the regional centers of the Pardee School of Global Studies. Thank you all for joining in this transatlantic conversation with Professor Duncan Kennedy. The topic of the day is legal academia itself, and this is meant to be a reflection on how to do legal scholarship in a way that is hopefully helpful beyond the realm of academia. I'm going to say very little about each participant, just to introduce everybody. Please forgive the brevity of this introduction, but we have a lot to talk about today. Duncan Kennedy is the Carter Professor of General Jurisprudence at Harvard Law School. I hear that he retired a while ago and is now emeritus, but considering his intense level of intellectual engagement, I am not sure that's true. Among his many fields of inquiry, most relevant today are the globalization of legal thought and the politics of private law. We will start this webinar with Professor Kennedy's remarks, and we will then proceed with interventions of the 5 co-panelists in this virtual room. Marija Bartl is Professor of Transnational Private Law at the University of Amsterdam, where she directs the Center for Transformative Private Law. Poul Kjær is professor at the Department of Business and Politics of the Copenhagen Business School, where he works on socio-legal theory, European integration, and global governance. Joana Mendes is professor of Comparative and Administrative Law at the Faculty of Law, Economics and Finance of the University of Luxembourg. Agustín Menéndez is professor of law at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, Department of Public Law and Legal Philosophy. Harm Schepel is professor of economic law and director of law programs at the Brussels School of International Studies at the University of Kent. And I am Daniela Caruso, timekeeper and responsible for everything. Elizabeth M. Ryan, assistant director of this center, deserves much credit for all the logistical support always. We have several attendees today whom unfortunately right now I can't see, but sincere thanks for joining us. The Q&A function is active, so please use it to send comments, and I will do my best to incorporate them in the discussion after the first part of the program. If I fail to acknowledge any such comments, please forgive me, and rest assured I will pass your comments on to the panelists so that we can all follow up after the workshop. Without further ado, Professor Kennedy, please start this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for negotiating this event with me, Daniela. It was a very interesting exercise, in fact, of almost transatlantic dialogue in which Daniela represented for me what I needed to address in order to have a transatlantic dialogue. I'm all my life have been very interested in Europe. As a law professor, I've been very interested in European law and European legal academia, but here my goal is to know in my heart that I know nothing about it. So I'm very much like the person who was a tourist and knew everything, read the guidebook, and I really, really was hip to Europe. But as time has passed, I realize it's more and more mysterious to me. So, for example, in this context, I really have no idea who you are. Poul is the only person who I really think I have some sense of as a result of having had a dinner with him once. So this is the level of, engagement I start from, and for the participants in the audience, I have no idea. So I want to find out. I'm basically not here to be informative so much as I am to be inquisitive. So the topic was the thing about which I'm inquisitive, which is critique of mainstream legal academia from the margins. I chose that to describe in a complicated way an abstract version of my own situation, which is in some ways, and what I'm looking for is where, given that in the world, there's mainstream legal academia everywhere, and there is critique everywhere, and there are margins everywhere, assuming that it's completely different in every place and completely different in Europe than it is in the United States. Nonetheless, that abstract definition is enough to make me want to know, are there other people? What is their experience within those abstractions? So first, I'm going to very quickly say something about each of the keywords. So mainstream legal academia, that which I see myself as participating in as an American legal academic, is the mainstream legal academia, which is roughly described as professors and assistant professors and clinical professors in the 180 law schools in the United States. That's about 7,000 people. And the 7,000 people, they're professors, assistant professors, and clinical professors, pretty simple structure compared to many places. And they are liberal and conservative. So as I approach it from the point of view of critique, the critique is a political, by critique, I mean something political. Both a critique in the sense of they don't get paid enough and they're boring, that kind of critique, but also critique in the larger sense of the critical tradition, critical theoretical critique of bourgeois ideology. So I start from the idea that legal academia is what Gramsci would call a large ideological intelligentsia of the ruling class. I do think of it that way, very Marxisant, in spite of the fact that I don't believe in the labor theory of value, as you now know. So it's an ideological intelligentsia, it's internally divided, its divisions are completely important to it. So people within it understand the mainstream is divided politically into the left, right, and center, and they are looking at each other. So the left and the right look at each other across and through the center, and their universe is one in commonsensually bounded by the idea that the alternatives in life are liberal, centrist, and right, and that things that are ideas about what law is or how to do it or how to be political within it, outside that circle are what I mean by marginal. So if you're outside the shared sense that that's the meaningful debate between those positions, and the center is obviously crucial, the margins are not crucial, the center is crucial because they are, in a sense, the audience for the ping pong game, and they're the available people to be chosen and recruited or whatever. So the critical point of view from my point, this is from my point of view, is basically this experience is one in which I disapprove of. I think that that ideological intelligentsia is bad in its overall effects in many ways, that it legitimates the status quo. But the background idea is that what one ought to do as a critic of this kind is to analyze the way in which it is an ideological intelligentsia, which is reproducing a status quo, and do things that are designed to attack it or shake it. So I start from a classic Marxist antagonistic attitude, although again, I don't believe in the labor theory of value, which is that this kind of a project is an antagonistic or aggressive project. So it's devoted to an attack, which is also in the interest of the victim, but not being a victim. So the posture of attacking it from the margins is, I'm not a victim. I'm a beneficiary of the status quo. I'm fully within it, and I enjoy the enormous perks that come from it. But in this posture, I make the gesture, you may say the hypocritical or absurd gesture of saying, now I'm going to try to do things that are in the interests of the people who are the losers of the system. So then the question is there any position to the left of the liberal part of mainstream legal academia? So if mainstream legal academia, as is true of the other ideological formations, gets its existence because it is internally contradictory, but in a way that does not undermine its coherence as an upholder of the status quo. So the liberals and the conservatives hate each other. They think they're totally wrong. So what is it to take the posture that I just said, this snotty posture of saying, I'm outside that, I'm more against it. Even the liberals are some way complicit. Even the moderate left is in some way complicit in the status quo and in my self-righteous lefty way. But what do us, people like me, who claim to be to the left of the liberals, to the left of the progressive part of the mainstream, what is it about us that's any different? So it constantly occurs that it turns out that we are just progressives. We turn out to be just liberals. We claim to have all kinds of fundamental ideas and to be challenging the status quo. And then next to us in the next office is a guy who is a completely conventional social democrat, may run for office as a left social democrat, as a feminist scholar who is a women's rights scholar, whose ideas are more radical than ours about one thing or another, but firmly identifies with the idea of liberal equal rights for women, say. So a very basic existential issue is, how do you distinguish yourself if you want to? Now, I do believe that it's useful to start by saying that in my own experience, as an organizer of networks to the left of American progressivism, an initial phenomenological existential thing is the basis of the organizing, rather than a theory of what is to the left of the progressive mainstream. So my own experience in life of many 45 years of doing organizational things is, you don't get the person and you're not there yourself as a result of having a correct theory of what is to the left of the liberal mainstream. Something else is always going on. And I would say really always, never not going on. So what makes a person want to find an excuse or a rationale in which I affirm why I am to the left of the progressive mainstream? The other person, it always turns out that there's something motivating it as a search. So the enterprise that I'm talking about is historically the search for an explanation of why emotions, commitments, and actions from the left, and that are antagonistic and are a part of an attack on the mainstream, to rationalize them after the fact. So the problem is to rationalize after the fact a deep existential need to rebel. Both, now, there are two different dimensions of it over and over again. One is the outcomes, looking around saying, this situation is so shitty for so many people, and the mainstream isn't doing anything about it. This is terrible. We're all complicit. But it's also that the mainstream is doing subject construction. So there are always two dimensions. There's the outcome, which we are not directly implicated in if we have middle-class jobs, even at a low salary. There's that, but then there's the other thing, that the mainstream is constructing us as subjects in ways in which we can feel are oppressive, or actually we don't think we share in them, but we're surrounded by people who have been somehow turned into pods or distorted by the mainstream's construction of our own social universe. So this part of it is not about the life of underclasses. It's about the life of the bourgeois intelligentsia. So, well, now in my last part, here's what I've currently come up with. So now describing an existential search to explain why I'm better than the progressive mainstream with my deep critique from the left, both of the implication of the mainstream in oppression and in its pathetic subject construction of boring, culturally dead life, gender dead life. So I'm trying to explain why I'm better. So this paper contains my most recent attempt to explain that, by the way, I guess it's Nietzsche who has an essay called saying why I'm the smartest person in the world. So it's one of his it's the weirder of Nietzsche's essays. So here would be the idea. The idea for that would be something like, we, this constructed we, which is a US we, it's not a European we. I don't understand myself as having described a European phenomenology, though it might be. Who knows? I honestly can say I don't know. So the idea is that the we, of which I'm a part in the US and a part of an organizing effort that's been going on since the late 70s, is the attitude that we don't want to deploy our legal skills in the name of the universal, in or about law. So the idea is legal work that's supposed to produce effects in the world with the purpose of defending the interests of the imagined oppressed and our own subjective construction interests in cultural resistance. So the idea is now a contrast between three characteristic progressive attitudes. So one would be, we understand law to be the repository of a set of ideals, which are in some very basic sense universalizable. And those ideals, when properly understood, lead to very strong advocacy and belief in legal changes that benefit the poor and are progressive from a subjectification point of view. So the legal posture of the person inside the system is the one in which there's no conflict at a basic level. The law as it is, and the legal scholarship of conservatives as it is terrible. We represent there, as a progressive, one represents both the high professional ideal of being the best jurist and being the person whose project is politically good and virtuous, from a point of view that can be argued back in a Habermas sense. We can now enter into the dialogue with the conservative opponent from a universalizing position, appealing to the opponent on the basis of similar universalizable values, but with radically very, very, very different consequences and positions. So that's a kind of, that is the idea of the immanence of law. So law and the perspective of critique are then coextensive. It's a world of struggle, and the ideological struggle can be bitter, it has ups and downs, but that's how it's contained. So here would be a more radical point of view, which is still what I'm not talking about. That point of view would say, above the law that is, with its immanences, there's something else, there's a higher normative order, which could be rights, by the way, it could be something in very quasi-legal terms like human rights, but it also could be justice, it could be equality, it could be, so rights, human rights, justice, equality, dignity, very strongly asserted as not something that is necessarily immanent in the existing legal order at all, as something, in fact, which could be understood to be deeply opposed to it and to require a radical revision of it. That's the more left part of the progressive side, but not even slightly what I'm talking about. So I would say the sharpest distinction between the people who I think of as right next to me is between these people and me. And by me, I mean quite a few other people share the attitude I'm about to express. But so this form of progressivism, which is something which is meta to progressivism, meta to the legal order, requires its radical revision. So then what one works for is to develop as a jurist the kinds of critique of the mainstream in terms of these ideals. Now the crucial thing is shared with the mainstream to make the argument to the center and to the right from the progressive that you in the center and the right should be in favor of very radical change. Third position. So this is the position that I'm trying to develop in the last pages of the paper. It's the position that one should do the work to develop the strategies, the legal strategies for the appropriation of surplus by the people who are imagined clients or in the interest of the modification of subjectivities in the direction that we as ideological partisans of a particular postmodern subjectivity are in favor of. So there the idea is the universal is abandoned in a sense in favor of a brutal instrumentalization of law in the interest of the imagined client. And that is open to a deep critique. That is, it isn't putting on the table right away a universalizable criterion of how much it's permissible to do, where to do it, what means to use, or even a criterion of exactly how one ought to identify where to do it. No, the substance of these articles is about how to do it and where to do it. So the perspective of the article, only in these pages is there a discussion of whether it's permissible to do it. So of the 80 or 90 pages that will include all this material on low-income housing markets and credit markets, this is all there will be about the question of whether it's legitimate to do this at all. And I think it is a completely fair question to be asked from an American, I'm not talking about Europe, progressive position point of view, Ackerman's attempt to answer the question whether reforming private law rules to expropriate people who deal directly with your client groups, not tax and spend, not nationalization, but trying to expropriate the landlord, to expropriate the seller of low-income credit while keeping him in the market so he can continue to serve the constituency, isn't radically unfair. That arouses serious anxiety among Americans who consider themselves to be very progressive liberals. And it goes with the other fear that it never works. So the basic ideological coherence that creates the left boundary of legal academia in the United States is the combination of the conviction that you never ever succeed. The minute you screw around with the market, it backfires and you hurt the people you're trying to help. And moreover, this type of unprincipled, strictly distributive aggression against a groups of people, which can be at all levels, they're not necessarily poor, they can be banks, they can be anybody, but it's non-universalized direct aggression without an explanation of why they are particularly responsible. The liberal principle of no penalty without fault, there's no crime specified. Their only crime is they're making money off the poor when the whole system is exploiting the poor. When what they're doing is actually a very small aspect of the overall activities by which people benefit, but they're targeting. So hopeless and illiberal. Now, I could be wrong. This is my basically intuitive diagnosis of a very large milieu in the United States where there are about 7,000 law professors. And today, probably a majority of them are liberal or centrists. There are a lot of conservatives. There are a lot of progressives. I claim to be diagnosing the progressive world of the mainstream with the goal, now marginality. This position is marginal in the sense that, first of all, in the American system, and so first of all, let me say, I'm not marginal. That is, I'm the Carter Professor Emeritus. I'm not in any way marginal. I've been a professor at Harvard Law School since 1971. I actually have quite a bit of institutional power in the system. I can get people jobs, and I know how to do that. So I am, in a sense, a capo di scuola in the Italian sense. But the school is marginal. I'm not marginal. The school is very marginal. It once was pretty salient from 1980 to 1995. It was not a marginal school, but it is now very, very, very marginal. But the marginality, so that's sociologically marginal. But the position is marginal in terms of the views of the intelligentsia as well. So sociologically marginal, also because nobody's interested in critical theory in the US at all. Law schools are antagonistic to that, except many progressives. So marginal because this point of view is understood as antagonistic to a fundamental aspiration of people in the progressive mainstream, which is to understand themselves as in universalizable Habermasian exchange with the center and the right. So to walk away from that is to put oneself off the map of relevant conversation. To be a liberal progressive law professor, it's part of the identity to universalize, either for radical change or to make the imminent transformability of the system based on superior legal technique and scholarship and thought. Once you're not doing that, you become marginal in a basic way. That's the end of my, I hope that was, how long was it?
That was 23 minutes, Duncan. I apologize for being so clumsy with this.
And I apologize for talking for 23 minutes. So now, no questions, please.
Okay, guys, so we can proceed in any order. Let me start. So alphabetical is what I used in the introductions. Let me start with Paul, who was the first one who joined this webinar. Professor Paul.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm also unmuted now. Thank you, Duncan, for the captivating piece and the nice talk. And also thank you to you, Daniela, and the other organizers. It's wonderful to be here. The talk was inspiring, but it did not really go into the essence of the paper that was circulated, at least to the commentators. But I will delve a bit into the paper, but also try to link it to the talk as we go on. Because you make a very beautiful reconstruction of the relationship between Ricardo and Marx in the paper. And I think actually that stands very much in its own right if you take it as a piece of history of ideas, so to say. As such, it's very nice. It's also very nice to systematically explore a position of the left, as you said now in your talk, that you have been essentially trying to do for the last 50 years or so. But I wonder if it's not time to do with Marx what he himself did to Ricardo, that is to extrapolate the theory and make a more complex and a more refined conceptuality. Because what Marx did was essentially to take Ricardo's model about land use and a surplus value, which was made from an agrarian society, and extrapolated to an industrial society. And he made a far more complex model out of it. But as you surely know, since the 20th century, since 70 years ago or so, you see also that the Marxist model is expanding and has been bursting out to all sorts. And for example, we see that the concept of capital, if you read Bourdieu, there's not only economic capital, there's social capital, there's cultural capital, there's academic capital. Robert Putnam made the same point. James Coleman also talked about social capital. And in a beautiful piece from 5 years ago or so, Jeffrey Hodgson actually lists 26 different types of capital in the modern society, ranging from health capital to network capital to human capital to even erotic capital. And that means there is plenty of capitals out there in the 21st century, which cannot really be captured with the, even, I was not with a classical Marxist kind of vocabulary, but not even with a revised Marxist vocabulary. And I think that's where the problem is for those who want to explore a position at further out, left of the center, so to say. It is a lack of a proper theory. Because essentially there is two options when we see that the social reality as it is, that there is now a far complex range of capitals out there, or at least that we have conceptualized far different types of capital. And there's actually two ways you can go. Either, as Hodgson also suggests, simply go back to a pre-modern concept of capital. Simply, this is only money invested in something. That is capital. Nothing else is capital. Or you extrapolate the concept and make a far broader range and talk about capital in all sorts of settings, from education to politics to science and so forth. And that's also a point Hauge Bunkhorst did in his beautiful book from 2014 on critical legal revolutions. Günther Teubner, by the way, also tried to do the same last summer in an intervention in Verfassungsblock. So the point is here, we might need to have a whole range of different capitals in play. And I think actually that will help you also to look into your issue of the poor and housing regulation, because I think here people who tries to develop a position of the center, left of the center, they basically ends up conceptualizing this as a purely economic problem. But obviously, it's a far more complex problem. And I think also urbanization itself is a very good example of this. Poor neighborhoods have a whole entanglement of different problems, which are not only related to money in a narrow sense. But taking this view, you kind of reinforces the focus on the money part, the economistic part. This is Leninist economism to a certain extent. And I'm not really sure that is helpful. And that's also maybe in the end, it ends up with the problem that is this actually you go against the universalizing position, but what does it then become? It becomes an individualistic tool of struggle. And that is left-Schmittian. That is Carl Schmitt's version, or the left-wing version of Carl Schmitt, where the partisan fights as a way of life and engages in his partisan or her partisan tactics against a stronger power, so to say. And that is very much what post-Marxist theories today, at least in Europe, are about. The question is, does that really help the poor to make, so to say, the fight, the antagonistic fight, as into something which is a way of life in itself? Maybe it makes them happy when they go to bed, but fundamentally, I'm not sure it really helps them. So in that sense, I think this, to a certain extent, although a beautiful paper, also shows the lack of a proper conceptuality of a generalized, if you wish, even a universalizing theory of the left, which is not there anymore. And that means we end up with this individualistic left-Schmittian kind of leftover alternative. And my final point is, the easiest solution is maybe just for you to move to Europe. That would solve the problem to a certain extent. So I think to sum up, beautiful piece, but I don't really see where the alternative theory is, only where the alternative instrument of battle is for an antagonistic battle. And is that really what we want? Question mark. Thank you.
Duncan, please take notes, because we're going to hear many more of such reactions. So who would like to go? Who would like to go next? Maria, are you next?
Okay. So it is a bit difficult, I have to say. So Duncan, I'm a huge fan, and I'm a private lawyer. So I love the paper and I love your remarks. It is a little bit, however, difficult to kind of try to reinterpret the remarks that I prepared, and I struggled to prepare because I agreed with so much of the paper, to a little bit integrate them with what you have just said and what has also Poul said with regard to left-Schmittian individualized struggle. So basically, I think that possibly a different way, and I would hope more in some ways, more kind of not a friendly way, but more understanding way to your position would be to try to kind of little bit inquire or what do you mean by distributive analysis in your wonderful paper? So in a way, so I assume that most of that, what I will say now, you would actually describe as some version of basically suboptimal progressivism, but I'll still try. So in some ways, you kind of stress in the paper that one way in which we need to understand private law as, in a way, doing the work of both privileging and empowering is by distributing bargaining power. And of course, as a private lawyer, there is no way that I would ever dispute that, quite to the contrary. What seems to me, however, is that this story, and again, this possibly very much draws back on my European sensitivities, really, that this story is kind of very much of a micro story. So it doesn't really, address, much more structural ways in which private law privileges groups and makes and deprivileges others. So through the ways in which markets are structured, through finance, corporate law, contract, also through the ways in which private law shapes subjectivities. For example, consider just like European consumer law is a great example, because it really tries to promote something which one may describe as a savvy consumer shopper. So in some ways, so a different way how to kind of say what Poul has just said, it seems to me that you present very much a micro story. So a story kind of bilateral story of bargaining, and somehow we engage in all those micro struggles. But that's not the whole story of distribution qua private law, and that cannot be also the whole story of what we try to kind of intervene into and change. So, well, you know, so okay, so I hope I will not touch anything too sensitive here. But for example, I think that if there is anything for what Katharina Pistor deserves some credit is that she kind of in her book she starts telling this kind of macro story of private law. So a story of private law which goes beyond just the kind of collection of micro struggles that we may have, and then wherever we end up with that, but rather a macro story of distribution or structuring of markets and you know big distributive setups that private law so much contributes to skews in a way. So my first question then would be very much how do you see so how do you kind of relate your kind of more micro bilateral left Schmittian project to that of Pistor, which is much more of a macro project, you know, of macro distributive analysis? So do you see them as somehow relating to each other? Do you see, so where do you see Pistor, for example, somebody like Pistor on this scale of different progressives that you have mentioned? Also, because I see Pistor as in a way, you know, as somebody writing in the US but bringing to the fore many more European sensitivities than I think some of what you have actually just presented. Okay, so this is the first point. The second point is very much my something that I wanted to ask you, because I don't know who is a better suited person, and it very much also relates to the conversations in academia and to the role of us as scholars, and you know, how do we think about engaging in any political struggle. So it relates to transatlantic conversations in the context of critical legal studies on the one hand and new law and political movement on the other. So, you know, so today, you know, if you're a Crete in Europe, you know, there's quite a bit of us here. I do not know in the US after 95, but one of the kind of most joyful things that have happened has been the emergence of law and political economy movement, not because we see it as so much different to what we have seen in so many different contexts, but mainly because it is very exciting for especially younger scholars to you know, it's very inspiring to younger scholars. They want to be part of that conversation, and it's extremely important, I think, for us as a class. So so the question then there is that, you know, so I often recommend to my students and PhD students as a source of inspiration, you know, go to LPE blog, read some of the stuff there. But, you know, there is always, you know, whenever I do that, there is always this gnawing concern in the back of my mind, which somehow, which I have never actually had whenever I started to engage much more strongly with legal realism, critical legal studies, etc., etc. So I would very much like to hear from you. What do you think? So how do you explain why do I have those concerns, and what is kind of valid on those concerns? So
which concerns?
So I will tell you. So now I tell the concerns, and then you tell me what do you think. So there is this whole thing that many of young scholars want to establish something like LPE in Europe, so that we actually try to kind of join forces with American colleagues, and we kind of establish this movement, a European kind of branch of the LPE movement. And so my concerns are, you know, threefold. I have no clue whether I will manage to say even one of them. So the first concern is really that, so the overall concern is that, you know, so I have a concern that this may actually undermine our capacity to prioritize those struggles and strategies in Europe that are much more kind of important at this particular point of time. So this may happen at different levels. So it may happen at the level of the framings of the problem. This will happen also, you know, of course, if we frame a problem of racism in Europe similarly to that of the US, we totally miss the point. So this will happen at the level of framings of also of the solutions. You know, so and this, I think, again, I think links to what Paul said about the need to move to Europe. So I think if something typifies the European imaginary of how progressive social change should take place, it would place much more public institutions in the center, not only public institutions, all kinds of other institutions in the center. And that, in the US, the contrary is have been very much the debates that you have actually mentioned, boundaries of freedom, limits of efficiency, all those things which are relatively also not so fundamental or not so central to our concerns. So in a way, so also kind of going with the flow of this, or it's a massive energy which is coming with the EPL or Law and Political Economy movement, really can misplace both the framing of problems in Europe and solutions. So, and somehow I think sometimes I feel guilty that some of those concerns are possibly unfair because I didn't have them with critical legal scholars, critical legal studies. So I wonder, is it because I kind of came to it when I was younger and naive, or is it because there is something fundamentally different about law and political economy movement as compared to CLS? Okay, this I'm totally, and I'm not even manage everything. What can I do?
Thanks, Maria. Who wants to go next?
Shall I?
Joana, please, yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much for Daniela to organizing all this. Thank you very much, Duncan, for your availability for this discussion. And I would like to engage with the latter part of your talk, with the different levels of being progressive, to put it roughly. And it seems to me, I think also from reading your paper, I think that this strategy of targeted intervention that you're advocating, well, I can't speak for the whole field of European public law, broadly speaking, and there are people here in this talk that will be able to contradict me at any point. But I would think that is bound to remain relatively marginal, and I wouldn't even see how that could work, at least in the fields in which I work. And it seems to me that this higher, so this second layer that you've mentioned, this idea of there being a higher normative order that is not necessarily immanent in the legal order, but that in itself would require profound change, is more, is a possibly, I'm not sure, a more fruitful path to go. And I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody who's been working in fields where this very idea that, so the premises that you start from, this very idea that distribution is contingent on legal rules, that analysis of critical legal studies or law and economics or law and political economy can unfold those dynamics, can unveil those dynamics, can demonstrate that even thinking in those terms would already in itself be progressive enough and radical enough. But my perspective when I heard you and when I read the paper and when I read other proposals that go more or less along similar lines, I always bump, and maybe this is, again, in the spirit of a conversation, so this is purely subjective, I always bump into somewhat the frustration, then where do we go to from here, right? So we know-
Where do we go what?
Where do we go to from here? What do we do now? We know the dynamics, we understand what is going on, but how is it possible then to induce legal change as legal scholars, so not as activists or lawyers? And I think that this higher level of abstraction of working with these universalizable categories or values or principles matters. I'm not saying that what you are proposing does not work. I'm just saying that without transforming the categories, the understandings of law, the type of action that you are proposing, again, speaking from the fields where I come from, I don't think that they would bound to that they would work. Thinking for so how how can one bring social justice considerations to fields where social justice considerations are not at all a consideration from the actors that are advocating law, using law, and constructing law in that field.
So
even
those
though,
are who say one word again about who you are talking about in that list. Who are those people?
who are those? I'm talking about lawyers, I'm talking about scholars working with case law, I'm talking about scholars analyzing processes of administration that bring with them the categories that of the liberal framework that inform all the categories with which we work. So what I'm saying is that, for example, think of a field of like financial regulation. How in a field like that, I don't know, I'm not a financial lawyer, so how in a field like that would one be able to mobilize, would there be legal tools that one could be able to mobilize to do that brutal instrumentalization of the law that you're advocating? What I'm saying is that prior to that, maybe one needs a legal reform of the system. I don't know how that would come about. Thinking in the terms of universalizable categories to change the legal regimes. So that is my reflection.
So then now we are back to alphabetical order. Let's do Agustín and Harm.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to Daniela for organizing the workshop. Thanks a lot to Duncan for engaging with the transatlantic discussion. I have to apologize twice. I have to apologize for being an ignoramus on American legal thought. And I have to apologize because I will immediately quote Marx, being a non-erratic, non-Marxist, to misquote Varoufakis. I think that what we basically share across the Atlantic is the ultimate question that on the Jewish question by Marx poses to lawyers, which is whether rights and the law are the ultimate cloak of exploitation, or rights and the law are a tool for emancipation. And that depends very much on how you read it, I would say. Stephen Lux has read it in terms of an incompatibility between Marx and rights. There are other possible readings. There are Kantian undertones, I would even say, on the piece. But I think this is the question. And in order to answer this question, I find much that I think we can learn from your proposal, which I would say to me, perhaps I'm naive, resonates with some, to use a term that is dear to me, dissenting voices in Europe. Il uso alternativo del diritto. There is something of a family resemblance there. This element of using, to quote you, arguments favoring the poor under existing political circumstances, engaging in a way with the law in order to make an alternative use of the law, I would say. But at the same time, and I think one can be very long or one can be very short about that, the European problematique, so to say, at this point, keeping into account the question from the Jewish question and looking into the eyes of those who are the poor, and thinking about the seasonal workers, and thinking about the hotel maids, and thinking about the riders, and thinking about the refugees, has a slightly different, perhaps the problematic is slightly different than the American one, for two reasons, I think. The first one is that it is very obvious that law works, and I'm referring especially to European law, as an element of exploitation, as a cloak of exploitation, very clearly. It works what the Italians call il vincolo esterno, the external constraint over democratic decision-making that is favoring systematically exploitation, not least the exploitation of profiting without producing of finance. I think this is very clear. And it's not only public law, it's also private law. Maria was referring to that, but the holy trinity of European fundamental law, so to say, is monetary stability, free movement of capital, and freedom of establishment. That's a tool of exploitation, I would say, in a systematic way. And then we are confronted as lawyers with what to do about that. And I think I don't have a full answer, and it's not the time to provide a full answer, but I think the first thing that we can do is to describe it. It has become so radical to describe what the law does. In a way, the old-fashioned black letter law is radical when one is confronted with that. The other thing, of course, the other side of the coin is that law, from the eyes of these very same people, remains also a force that can be a force of emancipation through political mobilization. And I think here the history is slightly different. We were looking very much to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We were looking to the civil rights movement. We were looking to Lyndon Johnson, Big Society, but the trajectories have been very different. Law, through political mobilization, we have codified into the law this element of emancipation. Law has become a tool for the weak also. And here, unfortunately or fortunately, I'm talking about your national constitutional law. I'm talking, for example, about Article 3.2 of the Italian Constitution that says that the state has to remove the obstacle, I'm just simplifying, but basically on the way of equality, of material equality, not only of formal equality. But if that is so, perhaps this explains also the difference, because this results in Marxist terms in a different understanding of rights, because rights are not only the schizophrenic rights of the bourgeois that are opposed to the identity of the same person as the citizen, but they are also collective rights. They are also collective goods. And this implies, as such, that the arena for the struggle is the political arena in which these collective rights and collective goods are specified. So I would say I sympathize enormously with the project, in which I find, perhaps, as I was saying naively, resonances of many dissenting voices in Europe. So there is fertile soil, I would say, to renovate this tradition, taking your insights. But I would say also that the agenda has to be slightly different, because the law also is slightly different. It's a straitjacket and a promise at the same time. And the two things have been developed in Europe. Thanks.
Harm, sorry. I was saying last but not least, for sure.
You mean the graveyard shift? Of course. Sorry, I didn't hear Agustín the last couple of seconds that he talked. I don't know if that's only my problem or whether there's something. I have the same problem that the others have, which is we have this wonderful, we're trying to connect it to the talk, and I think it's fairly simple to do, but a bit complicated for people who haven't read the paper. Yeah. So anyway, I think part of what Duncan is doing in the paper is to translate his left of mainstream liberal progressive academia into a legal strategy. And part of it, I think, so this is the part where I'm not allowed to ask questions. So I'm going to reconstruct what you said, and that way not posing a question, but a comment, as it's, academic corrupt practice. Okay, so the paper is called Law Distributes and not Law Redistributes, and I think that is important, and I think it is important to you in this sense that we know that entitlements are unfairly distributed, and that law plays a big part in it, and we know that the classic progressive social democratic response to that is to redistribute. And so tax and spend and regulation and housing and education policies and so on and so forth. Then of course the classic critique is that kind of politics insulates and ultimately legitimizes the market and treats background rules in private law as neutral and pre-political and pre-theoretical and so on and so forth. And so one of the moves you make is to say, well, let's apply the same logic we do to post-market redistributive policies to background rules in private law. So let's apply the same logic that we do to whatever, to property and contract, and have the same distributive political economy analysis of those background rules. And you say it explicitly. I'll read it to you because I don't read it to you, I'll read it to others. So when you talk about abolishing the Corn Laws in your discussion of Ricardo, you say, by the way, that's not crit. That's just normal political distributive analysis. Crit means doing the same thing, not with having or not having a tariff, but with having or not having freedom of contract, or say, fault-based tort law. The crit move is to take the analytic, the distributive analytic developed by Ricardo for a tariff, a public law measure that was a highly salient political economic issue, and apply it to something completely different. That is, to taken for granted background rather than foreground rules. Later on in the paper, more programmatically, you write, apply conventional neoclassical welfare economics to legal distributional questions that arise when we take seriously the idea that the rules of private law, as distinct from tax and spend and regulation, powerfully influence distribution. They do this because they constitute the bargaining power of economic actors. They do this before taxation and regulation. So there is a deep critique of legal institutions that constitute markets and do so in a way that is profoundly and grossly unfair and unequal. My question, which I'm not allowed to ask, is how this relates to the indeterminacy thesis, which you continue to espouse. And what I find fascinating in this paper is how you turn that around. So the indeterminacy thesis used to be attacked for being nihilist and whatever. And you now mold it into an intensely pragmatic political strategy. Basically what you say is, if they can do it, namely vest property and contract with whatever political outcomes and struggles they can win, we should do that too. It is almost as if you make the indeterminacy thesis into some sort of battleground where the tools they have should be used by us being better people than they, and we should win victories. My question, which is not a question, is, are you giving away too much of the intellectual tradition that you basically started, which is to say, the indeterminacy thesis is not to say everything goes.
Harm, sorry, you froze for a minute, so go back on the indeterminacy thesis. We lost you after that.
Because you think I remember what I just said. So, to go back to legal scholarship and legal academia, part of what renders property and contract not so indeterminate is the role of the legal professions and legal academia in giving it meaning and giving it the common sense understandings that are frequently used to defend the indefensible, namely in political outcomes. So my point would be, by turning the indeterminacy thesis into this political pragmatism, can you do that while still maintaining the intellectual tradition of critiquing legal academic thought and liberal legalism for actually giving meaning to those background rules that you are now turning into a political battleground? I hope that makes sense. Thank you so much for doing this and for listening. And thank you, Daniela. It's a great opportunity, and thank you for organizing this.
Thank you all. So Duncan, let's stick to the plan. So this is when you have the opportunity to engage, discuss.
Yes. So let me just say, this is a thrilling set of reactions for its, at least the way I hear it, it's very, very different reactions coming from very different places, representing different, again, as a tourist, meet one of you in a restaurant, the next one in a museum, don't know where you're coming from, weirdly different from each other, but there is enough certainly so that we can try to, so this was exactly what I was hoping for, I have to say. So I think that, how to do it? I think that I want to do it by trying to select out from what each person said, either what seems to me to be the nub of disagreement, nicely and always politely put, or something I didn't understand. So for some, usually it will be some element of both, but Poul, it seems to me, for me, it's perfect to start with Poul. And the reason for that is that there are two different dimensions where I can, I think, easily not answer the question, but so from my point of view, you didn't actually make any statements at all about the situation of the person trying to be on the left of European progressive thought that was otherwise than we need a new kind of theorization. So you didn't say anything about any actual current of critical of the academic mainstream at all. But you wouldn't have to, I mean, that wasn't the point. What you did was make the statement that what we need is my theory, okay, that's good, but we need a bigger, more encompassing and much more powerful kind of a theory, the one that I was proposing. So I would say that's a clean statement of everything I do not believe. So there's no word in those sentences which I agree with. In fact, to be honest, in honor of frank exchange, that strikes me as an absurd statement. The idea that that's what we need as people who want to turn the tools of legal knowledge, legal science to the purposes of progress for humanity, waiting around for that, we need not to be talking about that. We need to be talking about what can be done short of that. That's what the whole thing is about in my presentation. So now the second aspect, so that's the first element. The second aspect is that in the phrase Leninist economism, I love the phrases that let's see, there are a whole bunch of great ones. So Schmidian, left Schmidian individualism. So Leninist economism and left Schmidian individualism. So I said completely, frankly, and bluntly that that's not what it's about. And you obviously didn't believe me. Now, I'm familiar with this because, for example, I'm often accused of being a communist after I say I hate communism, or I'm an orthodox Marxism after I explain I'm not an orthodox Marxism. But I said explicitly in the text, this is not Schmidian and it's not individualist. And it's not left individualism, left Schmidianism. So what can I do to explain to you except to say again what I said? No, it's not left Schmidianism for the following reason. It rejects the whole problematic of rule and exception, including Agamben, who I consider to be a foolish monster as far as he's commenting on law. That's all nonsense from my point of view. I don't believe in it, and I've written a lot about how I don't believe in it. Well, then what? What is your alternative, Professor Kennedy, to the war of all against all? When I read you, I'm worried what's going to happen, who's going to be in control? Well, what I propose is simply the law of war, international humanitarian law as the model. So I know you know about that, and I'm very surprised that you ignored it, since it should be an interesting target for critique. So basically, I suggested the maxims of international humanitarian law, which are, first of all, you don't attack innocents if you can help it. When you attack them, you use the principle of proportionality. You don't do them any harm that is justified by your strategic objective. And excessive force is never permissible. So against either enemies or, no, what I'm saying is that's the best you're going to get, Poul. You're never, in the current context, unless Immanuel Kant comes riding in on a horse for Agustín, forget it. It's obvious to everybody in the left intelligentsia of today that if you wait for that, you're going to wait forever. So this goes back to the existential question. So if the idea of waiting forever for the theory appeals to you, almost certainly it means you don't have the motive, the crazy subjectivity that is hurling you, making you feel guilty when you don't do something bad about the existing order. So that's my response. I see you as a person I've been in dialogue with forever, and I think Bruce Ackerman might very well agree with everything you said. Now let me say that I also believe in expanding the paradigm, and I've written tons of stuff about other kinds of surplus. So I've written about the surplus of decision-making power in marriage that comes from there. The capital is not legal capital, it's career capital. In the article that I wrote for your book, I began to try to generalize beyond the economistic, and I've written all this stuff about neighborhoods, which are about integrated neighborhoods. It's not a critique of this piece that it doesn't do those things. That's not a good critique of it. Why should this piece do that? Now it gets me to now let me move on to, so now for Marja, the first thing is, I'm not sure to what extent what you're saying corresponds to what Poul was saying. So on some level, it sounds like you start out saying very sympathetic to British stuff, but then so private law rule distinguishing the structural from the, and this is also in Joana, the micro from the macro, the structural. The claim is that if you don't have a theory of the whole, if I disappoint Poul forever, but even my expanded theory that involves all kinds of capital will be equally open and vague, equally without the bite that will actually tell us what to do, there's something we need, which is an analytic. So none of you responded to the idea that this, except actually Harm did. I proposed an analytic to decide without a theory when something to expropriate someone. So it's obviously a flaw of the paper that this doesn't come across clearly. So what I proposed is when we think about what to do in the absence of a theory, and this, this very strongly applies to Agustín. So let me put it to both of you. So, okay, you want to be structural, rights are now reconfigured so they're on both sides. What's your theory? So you want to do something that's good for a group. You want to do the exact thing that Harm referred to as what a normal lawyer does about the repeal of the porn laws, tries to figure out how their clients will do, depending on the size of their agricultural estates. My claim is you have nothing to say about that. Basically, waiting for a theory, asserting the extreme complexity of institutions, the emancipatory potential that's there all along, or let's think big. To be blunt, I mean, there's nothing there, just nothing, zero, nothing, unless you have some way of answering the neoliberal who says to you, what you're proposing will hurt the people you're trying to help. Now, Agustín says politics, yeah, great, fantastic. I also am a lover of politics, I vote. But the question is, you need a way of deciding what battle you want to fight with what legal institutions to achieve what distributive goal for who. And this paper proposes a criterion, the presence of an identifiable surplus. Very, very sorry they're monetary, but they could be also sexual, they could be anything, that under the existing setup, you as a jurist have the capacity to take apart. It's micro, but it could be micro at the level of, let's say, how to interpret the Convention on Intellectual Property, or proposed and opposed by civil society. It's micro in the sense the analytic is devoted to the actual rules and the surpluses that they generate and the consequences of the changing in the rule. But there's no reason why it has to be micro in any other sense than that. And it's something that if you don't have it, the question is, how can you operate to the left of the progressive regime? The progressive regime, basically, here the idea is, its shortcomings are that it doesn't deliver either at the level of the economy or in subjectification and identities. If it's bad, the question is, which parts of it could be changed? So that's where, again, to Joana, well, it would be very well to have the meta level instruct us that unbelievably profound and gigantic changes are the only things will work because everything else is too micro. To all three of you, this distinction is not useful. The question is what criterion? So what I want to know is, what about the surplus criterion, which would say, now let me use an example, an international example. Daniela covertly subsidizes, produces surplus for people who want to talk about the way the general framework of the EU law of sovereignty operates in an exploitative way. The East versus the West, and to some extent, North versus South. So those dimensions of the federal regime don't get analyzed the way the conventional left analyzes sovereignty within the EU as a threat to the progressive potentialities of sovereignty at the national level. So when you say the beauty of the Italian constitution, and the fascist civil code, the two of them both have the social built into them against the individualists of their understanding of the prior classical legal thought regime. But when you want to decide in the European context, it's very easy to see the left is associated with the national regime in the post-World War II social rights in the constitutions, the social conception of property. But how does that work when the conflict is between French or Italian workers and workers in Slovenia? So when the Slovenians adopt all the different provisions, the acquis, to some extent, there's just a direct conflict between the bourgeois social rights of the Western Europeans and the shrunken rights. They still have all the same rights of the Eastern Europeans. Now, that's true at the rights level, but it's also true at free movement. So free movement and the free movement of capital as a structure, when we want to organize that, you can't just say it's bad. And I like everything Harm said except that. I mean, it seems to me wrong not to say, to understand free movement, we have to have an analysis of how it distributes, an actual concrete analysis of the distribution of what between who and who is being modified from what it would be in what alternative regime. Say a regime that didn't have free movement and allowed all kinds of, and the same thing is true for the common currency. So my basic argument is that the left of progressive position is to look for example, what kind of criticisms of EU scholarship at the EU level could be mounted starting from the premise that, as Harm said, the system is exploitative, and argue not, in fact, as though there were a meta system, but how this, that, or the other. So this would be, there's a little bit of that. There is some of it. Or to take another example, if you take the point of view of the Algerians in 1963, 1965, 1966, 1967, when the Algerians are cut out of the French Empire, you could ask, how would we critique the law of the EU and the mainstream scholarship that upholds it from the perspective of the French colonies whose economies were devastated when their wine imports were cut off. So no overarching theory, they cut off the wine import, and EU scholarship doesn't have in it a doctrine or an even imagined doctrine of obligations of the EU to the former colonies, or even today in the trade context, for the way in which enriching themselves has directly. Now, this is the exploitation point with a concrete allusion, a concrete reference. So I agree with the exploitation point. But what is exploitation? Marx's theory of exploitation is useless. So in effect, in my piece, I'm suggesting a theory of exploitation, which is you got the surplus when somebody else could have been given to it. So I'm reducing exploitation not to a normative criterion in terms of a general equitable theory, but to the idea that the people we like didn't get a surplus that was available. I think I'm going to stop there because this is I'm counterattacking you with pleasure. I would come to Europe only I would become a European to be able to have this conversation with you specifically, because each one of you is someone I've been in dialogue with, as I hope you see, for a long, long time. And your position is marginal in the United States because it is too preoccupied with the questions we've been discussing, as opposed to law and economics or liberal constitutionalism, which is what American legal academia, left and right, is preoccupied.
Duncan, I'm going to add just a couple of points that emerged from the audience. So I'm just grouping it in small buckets. One is, okay, so what about law and political economy? Is it something that should we be excited about or not? The other one is, so where do you stand? Do you think Medicare for all would be fun in the United States, would be a good thing? And the other one is, you continue to talk about left and right, but some in the audience wonder whether the left-right spectrum is still good as opposed to other models like the up versus the down, or the risk versus opportunity, or et cetera, et cetera. So I'll leave it there. And
So first,
yeah, so I let's see, it's a matter of, let's take a couple of reactions, and this time I would have Harm go first, if you would like to respond to Duncan now.
I agree with everything. He can't respond because I agreed with everything he said.
I came out of this unscathed. I want to keep it that way, so I'll shut up.
We want to hear about law and political economy, what Duncan
Yeah,
said.
that's fair, because that was your own question. So law and political economy is a great development. I think that it's totally American. I mean, it's intensely American in about 5 different ways, of which the most striking is the only people at LPE practically, now I don't want to exaggerate, but if you look at the conference that they organized, where they selected the people to be in they had 100 papers, they selected 40 papers in panels. The only people who have anything about anything outside the United States are the crits. So in LPE, participating in LPE among the active participants are the submerged people from critical legal studies. And there are many of them very active in LPE, and they represent complicated variants of the crit stuff that you, I think, are familiar with inside LPE. And very many of them are interested in other parts of the world and the comparative dimension, and say the difference between the strength of the state or whether the welfare state is statutory or administrative, all these things, they're interested in them, but they're a minority, because the genius of it is to mobilize young law professors who teach public law or private law topics, who are just part of progressive liberalism, articulating a left political agenda, which is utterly oriented to universalizing, either in the immanence or in the abstractions from above modes. So everything we've been talking about is what they're like. Now, a very important distinction is people are interested in small versus large. Some people are pounding for structural, others are saying all you can do is micro. Remember, I'm in favor of structural, but I like micro because it's palliative. So I want to use the word palliative because in the straightforward instrumentalizing way, if you can palliate, you ought to. And you shouldn't wait around for an abstract theory to justify palliation. And then for left and right, it's the same kind of thing. I'm not wedded to the left-right distinction in any way. What I believe in is what I said at the beginning, which is there's some unaccountable subjective reaction against the oppressive situation of the other and the subjectivation of one's own group, two different things. And so this is Camus. It's very straightforwardly inspired by Camus' idea of the rebel.
This was Duncan, let me say, this was exactly the conclusion of one of the persons in the audience, Akbar Rasulov, who said that this is actually closer to Camusian existentialism of the absurd than it is to left Schmittianism.
Akbar, I love you. Wait a minute. Oh, I'm totally in favor of, yes, Medicare for all. I'm totally in favor of that. I think it's a yes. The answer to that is yes, sure. So now here would be the question arises. Within such a system, what will happen to the cross subsidies that exist in the existing system? So the existing system is loaded with both exploitative and progressive redistributive cross subsidies in every aspect of both private, public, and semi-public medical care. Medicare for all is an absolutely, at the moment, open to a million different instrumentalizations because it doesn't involve abolishing the private sector. It's not creating a government bureaucracy. It's a very complicated regulatory compromise among the interests. And it will still involve conflicts of interest between doctors and patients, between drug companies and drug takers, between hospitals of different levels. It will still have to solve the gross misallocation of resources. It will in itself do nothing to establish how big the hospital for homeless people's bed section is in Boston vis-a-vis for people living in the suburbs of Houston. So I'm totally in favor of it. But what you like about it and don't like about it, I'm in favor of it. Big structural change, yeah. But we need a little discussion of the category of the cross subsidy in the delivery of bureaucratized systems that aren't the Soviet plan. Though the actual study of Soviet planning shows that the Soviet enterprise posed in the actual system the precise network of cross subsidies that would have to be worked out. So in the Soviet enterprise, childcare is free. Good for women because Soviet culture says women have to take care of the children. So let's privatize it and raise everybody's wages. Great. Raise everybody's wages. Men and women's races were raised. The guys control the household budget and drink themselves to death. And the women now have to take care of the children because they can't afford the privatized childcare. So if you can produce that analytic, I want to talk to you. If you're waiting to figure out how the concept of surplus or capital can be applied in many other areas, we aren't there yet. What we need is, say, my Algerian example or this example. This is what I'm saying we ought to be doing. How prescriptive, extremely prescriptive, yes.
To quote an anonymous attendee, what a wonderful talk this was. So I wanted to say I have enjoyed every minute of this. Duncan, you see now that when you meet one European, you have met one European, and that they come in different stripes and produce very, very different comments. My experience of talking to Duncan over and over has been one of progressively understanding the left critique of the left within the United States. And I must say, I don't know that I would have understood it were it not for personal experience of movements that were supposed to be profoundly egalitarian, responding to universal values, and ending up as deeply disappointing to me. And I'm talking about the side field of special education, distribution of special education services, wonderful progressive reforms that ended up having terrible distributive effects, in my opinion. Had I not seen that in the context of American politics and law, I don't know that I would have grasped the importance of the work that Duncan has been doing through private law and many other aspects of the law. In Europe, I have a hard time positioning myself, first of all, because I've lived away and I haven't had the profound experience as a grown-up in that system that I've had in this system. I wanted to bring this group together because I see that this is a group of persons who very much want to do the right thing with legal scholarship, who at some point in their life, one moment or another, sometimes more, sometimes less, have felt uncomfortable with whatever goes for the progressive left. And I think that this is going to be productive. Okay, so that we have seeded a number of questions that will allow us to be more discerning when we do transatlantic comparisons, and will allow us to be perhaps more insightful when we consider the law and political economy question of distribution going forward. I think the common ground is that we believe, I believe, Duncan believes, and I think most of us believe, in the importance of deeper and deeper distributive analysis of whatever bit of law we encounter. I'm going to wrap it up now and to say goodbye to everybody. The formal session of the workshop is over.